We are now 3 days out from the election. There's a mad scramble, of course, in Washington for people to get positions of power in the new administration. Some of them are good people, some of them are not. You are being widely discussed as potentially the next National Security Advisor or Secretary of Defense taking over DOD. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm fairly confident you'll play a large and meaningful role in this administration. You're never going to say any of that, but I thought that the audience might like some context for why we're having this conversation. I think you're one of the very few people with deep experience in national security who shares the president's priorities on national security, which is amazing. There aren't too many. You're, I would say, the leader of them. There's the context. What does this next administration need to do in order to remain true to the president-elect's articulated positions on war and peace?
Well, thank you, Tucker, and thank you very much. First off, for your confidence in me, it means a great deal. I don't
it's
make
heartfelt.
I know, and that's why I'm deeply grateful and honored. And I clearly don't make any presumptions about any role for myself. But what I would say, and I mean this with all sincerity, is that I think the president of the United States, the president-elect, is exactly right, that we stand on the possible precipice of World War III, and we need a fundamental change before we ram right into the iceberg. I mean, I think the election is over, but this remains absolutely true, is that what I call the liberal primacist alliance, basically the kind of policies of President Biden and Vice President Harris aligned with the primacists, I call them, we could call them the neoconservatives, have led us to a situation in which we're overextended, we're on the brink of war in multiple theaters, and we could lose them. And I really want peace. And more importantly, President Trump ran, to his historic credit, on an agenda, as he said in his sort of victory speech, I don't start wars, I end them. Now, I think my view is that we have to have, how you actually get to peace is a difficult question. And I had the honor of being on your show a few years ago when my book came out. And I remember, I don't know if you recall, but I said, I was thinking about your question to President Trump about why is it worth defending allies? And I gave that a lot of thought. And that, in a sense, my book is a response to that question. And I think you do need strength. You do. But
of course.
And you need peace through strength. But that term has become cheapened and distorted to become basically an excuse for an aggressive expansionist approach to foreign policy. But I think you do, it's real meaning. And President Trump is, in a sense, going back to the great tradition of the Republican Party, the Weinberger Doctrine, the Powell Doctrine,
yes,
Nixon, Eisenhower, as Bob Dole used to put it, these are Democrat wars. It used to be Democrats that started wars and Republicans that ended or avoided them. Eisenhower didn't go into Vietnam in 1954. He did not intervene in Hungary in 1956. Again, nobody thought he was a weak guy. So what needs to happen right now?
Before you get into that, I just think it might be helpful to describe where we are now, because a lot of Americans, I'm in this category, were so absorbed in the election that we may have lost touch with what you opened your remarks by noting, which is we're on the brink of war in multiple theaters. Will you tell us where we are?
Absolutely. Well, I think for the first time in about basically 150 years, we are not clearly the world's largest economy. We compete for that with China, and they are a far larger industrial power. Russia, in purchasing power parity terms, is a very large economy with enormous industrial production capacity. So North Korea advancing its nuclear missile program.
So Russia is a larger manufacturing economy than a lot of us appreciated, I think.
Yeah, I mean, despite a lot of boasting, they're still outproducing the North Atlantic Alliance, including the United States, in artillery production, which is old technology, by like a factor of 2 or 3. Iran's 2 weeks from a nuclear weapon, according to Tony Blinken. And worse, these actors have come together. Now, you will hear from the sort of primacists and liberals that means that we have to fight them all at the same time. No, to the contrary, it means they are collaborating together precisely to tie us down and deplete us. And that's what's happened in the war in Ukraine, where we have expended a tremendous amount of weapons, ditto in places like attacking the Houthis and so forth. At the same time, our defense industrial base has wildly atrophied from where it was 30 years ago. And this is why the agenda for reindustrialization is so important. But that's going to take a long time, as Senator Vance has pointed out. Meantime, China.
Wait, so can I say it's not, I thought one of the justifications, the main justification for this wildly inflated Ukraine funding was that it was going to help reestablish America's industrial base.
And in fact, one of the most kind of oft-used arguments by a lot of the advocates for the war in Ukraine was that we would sort of degrade the Russian military for a song and restore our defense industrial base at the same time. Actually, more or less the reverse has happened. The Russian military is larger, and this is, General Kavoli, the SACEUR, has admitted this. The Russian military is larger. It's battle hardened. I mean, our military has not fought a peer adversary, well, I mean, really since World War II, but certainly since Vietnam and Korea. The Russians have gone toe-to-toe with the Ukrainians, who are capable, and they have a revved-up defense industry at the same time. So in a sense, we're worse. Meantime, the Europeans have basically been asleep at the switch, not going through with their defense buildup, with a few noble exceptions like Poland. So, and then you look at China, which is by far the most formidable challenger, 10 times the GDP of Russia. This administration, Tony Blinken has said, Xi Jinping has given the instructions to their military to be ready for a war over Taiwan by 2027. Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force in the Biden administration, said the other day that he thinks the Chinese military will say they're ready. We have to be ready for this. My view is we desperately want peace. The Chinese are going to look at us both in terms of our strength, but also in terms of our political commitments. And this is where I think President Trump has been exactly right, which is being willing to talk to President Xi Jinping, not insulting President Xi Jinping and President Putin and others unnecessarily, not supporting things like Taiwan independence, and at the same time being prepared to be strong. And this is where I think if we appoint or if people are put into positions of power who think that we can walk and chew gum and do everything and start wars in 3 different theaters at the same time, not only will that be bad like it was in the Iraq War, and often the same people, it will be far more catastrophic. Tucker, I don't think this is an exaggeration. I think we stand on the precipice of losing a major power war for the first time in our history. So people need to know what time it is, and that really requires focusing on China with the purpose of peace, like we did in the Cold War, which was to say, we're going to be strong. We're not going to go over the line like Eisenhower did in 1950. He's not going to go into Hungary. We're not going to go to Czechoslovakia in 1968. But don't come across our line because you see it's not going to succeed for you. So I think we really stand at a crossroads. And I think President Trump has a mandate for peace. So I just, as an American, whatever happens to me, I so hope that we don't end up with the same failed recipe of starting wars all over the place or getting enmeshed in conflicts when we can't afford to do so, and they're not in the interest of the American people.
From a non-expert position, which is my position, just as someone who's watching kind of, there does seem to be broad recognition that whatever our objectives in Ukraine were, we didn't achieve them and we can't. Zelensky immediately comes out upon Trump's election and says, actually, I'm for peace. That does maybe seem like it's winding down. Oh, who knows?
I hope. Yeah.
But the noises are consistent with winding down. Yeah. So, but at the same time, the very people who are pushing that war all of a sudden like very excited about a war with Iran. Yeah. It's like they just seamlessly move. It's like, oh, Ukraine, whatever. Actually, the real problem is Iran, and telling us that Iran's trying to murder President Trump, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know what's true. I don't. But how would the United States, what would happen if we went to war with Iran?
Well, I mean, I think, look, Iran's a bad regime. We don't want to have a nuclear weapon. We don't want to support Israel. We don't want to be able to support groups attacking Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But like, haven't we learned the lesson over the last 25 years about the ill-advised nature of very significant conflicts in the Middle East that don't have clear goals and clear connection to American interests? Like, haven't we been didn't we run this experiment a couple times? And it's often the exact same people calling for war with Iran who were involved in the past. And it's like, shouldn't there be some degree of accountability? Moreover, it's like a bad idea in itself. I mean, like I was criticized in The Bulwark by Eric Edelman, who was Dick Cheney's advisor and number 3 at the Pentagon under Bush. He said my ideas were iconoclastic. And I was like, thank you. I'm delighted that you think my ideas are iconoclastic.
But how could Eric Edelman be writing with any credibility at all on foreign policy questions after being intimately involved in the Iraq War and then never apologizing? I don't know. There should be some international authority that requires contrition, like a moral UN where you don't get to say another word until you don ashes and sackcloth and apologize.
I mean, who among us isn't? I'm certainly not inerrant. I'm certainly not infallible, but at least show some, it's like Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal a year ago gave a speech to AEI, treated the Iraq War as like a mulligan. It's like, I think that's like a big deal. And, obviously a lot of people got to, had different views, et cetera. But it's like, it's kind of show the contrition, show the penance, show the learning. And so that I think is, the other thing though, Tucker, is like, it's the same people who are calling for attacking Iran, who are also calling for escalating the war in Ukraine or even a no-fly zone, recognizing an independent Taiwan or getting in a war with China or attacking North Korea. It's like if we do all those things, we know objectively as a fact that our military is not capable of fighting more than one major war at a time. So even if you did want to, getting in multiple fights with people at the same time is just like foolhardy. And I mean, but the way I think about it is the Washington blob establishment can get us into wars and crises, but they can't fix the problem. So it's really important right now. And it seems to me that, just listening to President Trump and his historic victory, the decisive mandate he got, his leadership, his mandate, his agenda for peace from a position of strength, use the military sparingly, but have it be strong. It's really important not to get enmeshed all over the place and either bleed ourselves out or in a catastrophic multi-front loss.
I think that's the last thing Donald Trump wants.
Certainly seems that way.
Right. I mean, the arc of his life is so remarkable. The redemption that we just saw on Tuesday,
it's amazing, yeah.
Without precedent really in American history. And so if you wanted to destroy his presidency, his second presidency, what's the one foolproof way to destroy it?
No president has ever lost a great power war. Donald Trump has run to his enormous historic credit. He has been shot. He has had lawfare conducted against him. And he has had the bravery and the vision and the persistence and the commitment at great personal physical cost, but also to his reputation, his family, et cetera, to stand up for these principles that the United States desperately needs, putting Americans' interests first, peace, prosperity, et cetera, reindustrialization. Now is the time to put that into practice, whoever it is. I can't stress how important that is. And if you're thinking about a historical legacy, Joe Biden's going to leave a legacy that's terrible. I mean, where for all the things, you mentioned the war in Ukraine, 2.5 years in, Julian Barnes' New York Times just reported that the intelligence community is reporting that the Ukrainians are losing, that it's not a stalemate. So after all that, after all the preaching, after all the moralism, the Ukrainians are losing the war and the Russians are making enormous progress. And we're unprepared. We're unprepared for a war with China. The Middle East is in the worst situation in years. We can't even stop the Houthis, like a third or fourth rate power. And we're not prepared. So they've left us on the precipice. They've put us on the Titanic is directing towards the iceberg. It's going to take a sharp turn. And the way I think about this, and when I had the honor to work for President Trump in his first term, when we worked on the defense strategy to try to get us to prioritize, again, in my view, with the same logic, very consistent with what President Trump, I think, was trying to lay out. That was like, we were a couple miles from the iceberg back then. Now we're like right up, we're a few thousand yards. And it's not easy to turn the Titanic. And if you turn the Titanic 90 degrees, people are going to fall out of their bunks. Chandeliers and beautiful, plates are going to get broken. But that's where we are. But that is the fault of what I call the liberal primacist alliance. That is the fault of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the primacist, sort of old school Republicans who, if they pursued that policy further, would lead us to catastrophe.
Then how is it that, from what I can tell, pretty much every person in the running for the big national security jobs other than you is part of that alliance? And I know them all, and I like some of them. A couple sitting U.S. senators who I think are really nice guys, but they're tools of the people you describe, like completely. There's kind of no doubt about it. How is it that there are so few people on the Republican side in national security with experience who agree with the president-elect who leads the party?
So I've thought a lot about this because I've been fighting, as you kindly gesture, in a sort of a lonely battle within the sort of blob to put us on, like, to me, what is common sense.
Exactly. Right? That's right.
And yet so few people do it. And why is that? It's so weird. And honestly, so much of your insight and some commentaries, both on this show and your other podcast interviews and your shows, et cetera, because I think there's a human sociological element. I mean, and one of the things that's kind of bizarre is that I think, like, today, people like us, we can learn a lot from the new left of the 60s and 70s. Like,
100%.
There's something wrong with the establishment and the way the establishment. Now, I believe there's always an establishment. There's an establishment in Mao's China, but we need a better establishment.
Well, that's it.
You're a fan of Teddy Roosevelt too. Like, the idea that, like, the establishment just does what it used to do is like, no, the point is the establishment is supposed to serve the people, right?
Of course.
But I think there's an element, and I try to give credit because, like, yeah, there's money and stuff, but there's other ways of making money. I think it's this psychic kind of like network benefit of being part of like essentially functionally an imperial capital.
Yes.
And everybody comes to, you know this, right? They come to the capital and say, you're so wise. We need your leadership. You're so moral and your vision. And it happens in Congress where people come, they've probably not thought about foreign policy that much. There are all these structures set up to kind of acculturate them. And again, like I don't want to sound too new left, but like this is kind of what happens. And so you need, I think, a clear-eyed view of how to change, and frankly, a willingness to buck the system. And this to me is like, and I'm certainly far from the only person to make this point, and I think you have as well, is like President Trump ran against the system. And that is so important because it's the system, the liberal primacist alliance, in other things like trade and economics, et cetera, that need to be a fundamental change. And already he's paid the price, literally, and shown the bravery and commitment to go through that. And so now it's about like capitalizing. And frankly, my hope is if that happened, a lot of these people, especially in the younger generations, would follow. And forgive me for a little bit of patting myself on the back, but I think it's an apropos comment. I was out at a thing a few months ago, and this young guy came up, strong guy, whatever. And he said, "Hey, Mr. Colby, I'm going into the Marines, and I just want to say all the young Republicans love what you're saying." And I said to him, I was like, well, that's good because all the old Republicans hate it. And he's like, yeah, that's the point.
Boy, do they. Boy,
right?
do they.
They do they. And that's like, to me, I think of myself, I'm like the first line, not to, this is, although, there are people out there you wonder about, but like, this is not like actually getting shot, but it's like, I'm trying to think about how do we protect Americans from not getting shot?
Of course.
Right? And so I think the young people can see it. The young people who are like, who are not bought in to, who have not been kind of acculturated, worked for X senator on this committee for 10 years and then went to that think tank and blah, blah, blah. I think they if you build it, they will come, but it's like the first echelon. we take a lot of metaphorical flack, hopefully metaphorical.
I won't go on about this, but I'm a little bit distressed by it, very distressed by it. But like someone like Mike Pompeo, I'll just say the name, who I don't think is going to get a job in this administration. I would pray that he's not. I think he's a criminal. I've said that. Plotted to murder someone who hadn't even been charged with a crime. That's a criminal act. Should be arrested for that. That's my view. But even if you don't believe that, he's been anti-Trump for 8 years, worked against Trump, and he's a crazed neocon. And he's still being talked about and promoted. Again, I don't think he's going to get the job, but promoted to run the national security establishment in the United States. How can that even happen?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's if I were advising President Trump, I would say, especially now that the mandate has happened,
yes,
why pick anybody who's not aligned with what you're trying to do? I mean, I saw the last ad that President Trump ran. I mean, it was a stirring ad, and it won. Who was in that ad? You, Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Vivek, and Vice President-elect Vance. That is the mandate, So like my hope is that he will own that. And that's the way for peace. And there's going to be debates about various policies and how to emphasize this or that. But why go back, especially in a situation where, as successful as the first term is, the situation that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are leaving President Trump in January is, I cannot stress how dangerous it is. And he's right. I mean, the way that President Trump, again, has commendably talked about the risk of nuclear war. I worked on nuclear issues a lot. My kind of starting point a lot was like working on nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy and arms control. I worked on arms control with the Russians. We should be afraid of these things. A salutary fear, not like an unmanning fear, if you will.
Right.
But like a salutary fear. The beginning of wisdom is fear, or whatever the Bible says to that effect. I should know that, but
it's true.
Is true, right? Is understanding and calibrating. And to me, one of the like touch grass kind of things about a lot of the people who are calling for like no-fly zones over Ukraine and intervening against the Russians and escalating and allowing U.S. weapons to be overtly used to attack Moscow and Russian strategic, forces sites, like. That is obviously crazy. It's like, time out. Like, that is obviously...
But there are many Republicans.
Yeah. In fact, some of the... That's why I think that the arguments within the Republican Party in some ways are fiercer, because my hope, Tucker, and I think this is something you've been, on for a while, but it's like the Democrats are like, they're sort of inherently out of position right now. Like, where is the left? Where are the people who are like anti-war? Where are the people who say the CIA is not above reproach or the FBI is not above reproach? Who are the people, Wright Mills or whatever, the power elite and all this stuff? Those people, those movements have to come back. And I think that that's something where, especially given the mandate that President Trump has won, that whatever you think of Bernie Sanders, the fact that he said like we're out of position, and others are saying they're out of position my hope is that Democrats will go back, in a sense, to the kind of arguments that I'm making that I think you could have heard a Democrat make 10 minutes ago,
right,
or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago. Hey, we've got to be able to talk to our opponents. We have to have a strong military, but not get into unnecessary wars. That's just common sense.
That's for sure.
Do you remember when Democrats used to refer to abortion as something that should be safe, legal, and rare? Well, they've changed their view on that. It went from a right to a sacrament. This isn't the pro-choice movement you may remember from 30 years ago. This is something much darker. And that's why we have joined forces with Preborn. They're a sponsor of the show and of our speaking tour to do something about it. It's the largest pro-life organization in the United States. And they are doing what they should do, which is speaking up against this atrocity. Killing babies after birth? No one seems to have the bravery to call that wrong, which it is. But Preborn is calling it out. Their networks of clinics are positioned in the highest abortion areas in the country, and they've rescued 300,000 babies. When a woman considering an abortion searches to end her baby's life, Preborn is there. The power of ultrasound combined with the love of God doubles the baby's chance of being born. A single ultrasound costs $28. 5 ultrasounds are $140. Giving women the information they need to make the decision that many of them actually want to make, to have a baby. Any gift will help, and all gifts are tax deductible. To donate securely, go to preborn.com/Tucker or call pound 250 on your phone, and when asked, use the word baby.
You mentioned CIA. Now is probably a good time to address it. Your last name is Colby. That is familiar. That's a familiar name to anyone who knows the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. Your grandfather ran it, William Colby. And there are two interesting things. One is, I'm sure this will set off just explosions of theorizing on the internet. So what is your view of CIA? I think that's why your family's in Washington, because you're...
Yeah, well, actually, my great-grandfather was a career Army officer, so I come from a kind of a national security, background. I mean, my dad not so much, but look, my view on the intelligence community, and I worked on this stuff myself when I was kind of early in my career, although on the commission that looked at why Iraq intelligence is wrong. I didn't agree with my grandfather for everything. I didn't know him super well. I mean, I know a lot about how he approached things and how he, his record and so forth. One thing where I do really agree with him, and where his legal training, and the fact that actually, as Jim Schlesinger said, he was the first liberal to become director of Central Intelligence, was that he thought, and I agree with him, that you need a CIA. You need a national security establishment, but it's not above reproach, and it needs to be accountable. And that's what he, the interesting thing about him, just to stress that I don't take any credit for it, like I'm just telling, just because you asked me, but he was in World War II. He was then a field guy. He was in Europe, and then he was in Vietnam for a long time. And then he kind of ended up as director by happenstance, as these things sometimes do, during Watergate. And he had not been really involved. He wasn't one of the inside club of like I see you got Dick Helm's book, The Man Who Kept the Secrets. He was the kind of ultimate insider, Washington operator kind of. My grandfather was out, unlike me, I'm more of a, DC type, policy type. But I think he came in and he said, there's a chance that, remember this, the Democrats at the time, the congressional class of 1974, very left-wing, a lot of them were thinking, let's just get rid of this place. Let's get rid of the intelligence community. Right. And his view is like, that's not good for our country, but it's not good that they're spying on Americans. I got in debates on some of these on Twitter sometimes about like whether the American government is funding some of the stuff, in Europe or whatever, or NATO, blah, 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 that's reverberating back into the American political system. It's like, yeah, it's happened before, right?
For a long time.
For a long time. So it's like, it's not unreasonable. And by the way, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And by the way, who were some of the people who were opposed at that time? Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld. They were opposed to any kind of Henry Kissinger, any kind of accountability for the intelligence community. And so that's how I look at it. I think there's a real need for accountability. Also in the professional military. What is this going on with 4-star officers recently retired who have no political vetting? They haven't been elected dog catcher, weighing in on extremely sensitive points on American calling one of the presidential candidates a fascist. That is wildly inappropriate. There needs to be a fundamental change. First of all, it's wrong. Second of all, it's not consistent with our constitutional order. Remember that our founding fathers who had gone through the revolution, who had fought a war against a great power and won, they were like, the nasty politics is a feature. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson talking about each other's mother, fine. Standing military, We only built a serious standing military. American military officers wore civilian clothes into the Pentagon as late as World War II, maybe even after. So we have come, this is since 1947, or since World War II, basically, and I think we need it given what's happening, but it needs to be accountable. The third point I would make about this group is like, where do they get off? Like, has our military been successful? Have our political military goals been achieved over the last 25 years? You know,
call me when you win a war.
Yeah,
no, I agree.
If you're Dwight Eisenhower, and by the way, that's most of that guilt goes towards the liberal primacist alliance, the politicians who did it, yes, but also the war leaders who, you know, for instance, H.R. McMaster wrote a book called Dereliction of Duty about how the generals in Vietnam did not tell Lyndon Johnson they couldn't successfully prosecute that war. Okay, I agree with you. How is the senior military done? So I think some humility, getting back to basics, and staying out of politics is really needed.
It's infuriating. It does challenge like the idea of our constitutional order. I agree completely, but it's also ominous. So when you read that the Pentagon now has a new policy where at the direction of civilian leadership, they can kill Americans in the United States, what is that?
I mean, look, there's a lot of things that need to be taken a look at where like we have gotten, especially after 9/11, where it's just metastasized, right? Where we need to ask ourselves, what is the right? And I think you've done this like commendably, where you're saying, look, you know, I was here on this position here and I'm same thing, where like, you know, but look at the costs. And people like, you know, who were, we would say on the old new left would have said, oh my God, this is going to be abused. And people like us were like, don't worry about it. And now they were right. So let's take a new look at that. Again, I think we need to have the capabilities, but I also think this is where this group, I mean, practically speaking, not only former CIA leaders implying that President Trump was a Russian agent is a wild abuse of the trust, because it's a special trust with classified information and special authorities. And it's almost like a religious obligation where there needs to be a self-discipline and an understanding that there's certain things you can't do. You know, and that's been deeply violated. And I think, frankly, Republicans agree that. A lot of Democrats or independents or whatever voted for President Trump. They've delivered a verdict on this issue. So I think you need people who have that balance, which to me is the American way, is to say, look, the people have spoken. This stuff got out of hand, and we need to have a balance, but we need to preserve what we need for our security.
What do you do in Ukraine?
Well, one is I hope the president is successful and leans forward on his plan to end the war. And I just say, I don't know what that is, but nobody knew what Dwight Eisenhower was talking about in 1952. Nobody knew what Richard Nixon was talking about in 1968. And nobody knew what Ronald Reagan was talking about in 1980. You already see indications that players, including President Putin, might be changing, and the Ukrainians for that matter. So I hope there's a basis. What exactly that looks like, I don't think you're not going to like liberate Crimea, right? That's obvious. And the war's not going well. I think that's step one. And I think the Europeans need to, this is something I've been banging on. It's just so common sense. And by the way, you want to talk about who's helping. Biden and Harris, would go to Europe and say, you don't need to worry about anything. But so would kind of primacist type Republicans. They would go to Europe and say, don't worry, we can do everything. We're leading. They didn't do the Europeans any favors. They didn't do the Ukrainians any favors, let alone, anybody else, let alone the American people, because they promised things they couldn't deliver. And this is something where, and I said this, I was Ross Douthat, we had an interview right before the election in the New York Times, where I'd get, isn't it, Ross didn't say this, but it was sort of like questioning the morality of what President Trump's saying. I don't think there's been a stronger case, a more important time for foreign policy that is more moral than what you see, which is the moralism, which is all intention. You see it on the left from Tony Blinken, just saying, the Ukrainians are fighting for freedom, so we need to do X, Y, Z, and then failing. The way I think about it is like, no, we need a foreign policy that's more like, how does a parent think about the responsibility of the child?
Exactly.
Or let's say you're on the board of an orphanage. You might have a really good guy. He goes to church every Sunday. He's like, but never cheats at cards or whatever, but he sucks at handling the money. You're going to hire a guy who's actually going to take care of the orphans.
Exactly.
And that is,
by the way, if all the orphans die, it doesn't matter how much you love them.
Exactly.
Or claim that you do.
You don't actually love them.
Well, of course you don't, because the purpose of a system is its effect. And what's the effect of the war in Ukraine is to depopulate Ukraine, and now to allow foreigners, including many Americans, including BlackRock, to buy the soil of Ukraine.
I mean, it's certainly not, whatever this has happened has definitely not been beneficial.
Well, the Ukrainians just lost Ukraine, but not to the Russians, but through the encouragement of the Biden administration. That's my view of it. But how close do you think we have come to a nuclear exchange with Russia during the last 2.5 years?
I think it's close. I mean, and Woodward, I'm not sure how reliable he is on everything, but I think the reporting that the Biden administration, which was against interest, was very worried about Russian nuclear employment in later 2022 is very, very concerning. I think it was quite real. And the people who were blithe and insouciant about it, I think is incredibly irresponsible and should not be near serious decisions.
Who are those people?
Well, I think you see this kind of liberal premises. There's a lot of people who signed the no-fly zone or who made comments on Twitter or otherwise around that time and have said, lift all the restrictions on the employment of U.S. forces. And by the way, what's very clear is a lot of these people, if given the opportunity, if they thought the political environment would bear it, would support direct intervention, which if we go to war with the Russians directly, the Russians are very prepared to use nuclear weapons. So we have to be realistic about what that entails.
What does that entail?
Well, I mean, I think the Russians, one thing about Putin that's important, and again, like you don't have to like the person to understand that we need to take this guy seriously, right? Is he, as he assumed power and took over from Yeltsin, which in the Russian mind was a catastrophically disastrous period, one of the first things Putin invested in was the recapitalization of the Russian nuclear forces. And the way Putin talks about Russian nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy indicates that he has a quite sophisticated understanding of nuclear strategy. And of course, a lot of it is speculation because thank God they've only been used once or twice. But it says to me this guy's credible and he has an idea of how to use them. You don't start by blowing up Washington, D.C. You start potentially with something like battlefield use, selective strikes against things like places in Europe or more peripheral targets, but it can go up there and then you manipulate risk. And if weapons are used in that way, you can see millions of people. I mean, and we have almost no defense against. That's why I think President Trump, for instance, like having a better shield would be great. But right now, we're pretty much denuded.
I just don't understand. I mean, I guess it's kind of late in the game to whine about it, but we provided, a missile defense shield to another country, but we don't have one. Like, how did that happen?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's something that we can work on. I mean, it's technically very difficult, but I think having something better than what we have now.
But we're always bragging about, the sophisticated use of our defensive missile technology abroad. Yeah. Like, did it occur to nobody that the purpose of the U.S. military is to defend the United States?
Well, it is. And by the way, up until the ABM treaty was signed in the late 60s, you would go around American cities and there would be Nike Ajax and Nike Hercules nuclear-tipped missile defense interceptors and other kinds, NORAD and all these kinds of things. So I think having a stronger defense of the American homeland makes sense. And also, people talk about the American military being used in relation to Mexico. It's like, well, I think Mexico is and the immigration issue is very, very complicated and everything, but the American military is to defend the United States, right? So that should be, so to me, the core missions of the American military that really need to be focused on is defense of the homeland, preventing China from becoming the hegemonic power in Asia, because I think we'll never reindustrialize, we'll never be autonomous and be what America needs to be if China dominates Asia. But I hope and think we can do that without a war, working with others that pull their own weight. And then having an ability to make sure that we don't have a replication of 9/11. Now, some of that is like being smarter about how we use our military. But I think some of it is, you got to keep tabs out there. And then I think it's about supporting, people say Trump is anti-ally. I think that's totally wrong. It's just a different model of allies that's obviously A, is much closer to the Cold War model, and B, is common sense, is like partnerships.
They say Trump is anti-ally. So our, of course, most important ally in Europe is Germany.
Yes, which is Germany. Totally...
and we just destroyed, and so, but by the way, we had a direct hand, this is not speculation, I'm willing to say it's fact, in blowing up Nord Stream. So I know we're blaming the Ukrainians, but we did that. I'm just going to say that. No, that's not true. It is true. So how exactly do we get to launch an act of industrial terrorism against our closest NATO ally? How is that allyship?
Well, the thing that's weird, and this gets, I think, also into the context of who benefits, cui bono, right?
Yeah.
Is so since the Ukraine war broke out, the European economy, and particularly the German economy, has been like in free fall. So there's this kind of cute argument for a while that we had somehow like benefited from Europe sucking air after the Ukraine.
I've heard many people say that.
And it's like, well, no, wait, hold on. Our point, if you go back to like Dwight Eisenhower and like common sense, is like, no, we want them to stand on our 2 feet. Like, I don't get a rise out of lording it over the Europeans. This is sort of this mindset that like...
Well, this is still fundamentally a European country. This was a European colony. So Europe is basically allied with the United States on a very fundamental level, or certainly has been for 250 years. So destroying Europe, well, right, with some exceptions, but in general...
You fight with the people closest to you.
Well, that's right. Yeah, but I mean, like, Christian Europe, right? It's basically our ally. And destroying Western Europe, which I think we've done... How does that help us? Well, I don't understand.
I don't think that it's... I mean, the interesting thing about that is, I mean, obviously we're, settled, originally by Europeans. Now we have people coming from all over the world, et cetera. But the thing is, actually, if you look back at our early history, we stayed out of Europe.
Oh, I know.
And we were actually more involved in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the Caribbean and Asia. Actually, so people say, "Oh, we're never going to get focused on Asia." I don't think that's true. The black ships opened Japan.
Exactly.
People were trading in a lot of the early American fortunes. The Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. That was China, right? People trading in Canton, sometimes with opium. And then like Samoa, Hawaii, etc. So I'm not saying like we have a strong interest in Europe.
The
Philippines, of course. Thank you. In fact, my great grandfather. We were talking about our families. Like he was an army officer in the interwar period, and he was stationed at the American. There was like a concession in China, not China's proudest period, but that we were present. So what I think that means to me is a couple things. One, if you actually go back to American history at our best, and really kind of the first really until 1989, we did pretty well, with the exception, I think, to things like Vietnam and stuff like that. But it was pretty hard-nosed. Like, you go back to Washington's farewell address, Hamilton, et cetera. It's like, we're looking after number one. So this idea that America first is somehow inconsistent, it's like, by the way, a republic is supposed to be in the interests of everybody, right? Like, that's the definition. So when people say Trump is transactional or whatever, I'm like, good, right? He's like the CEO of America, and the board is saying, hey, look after our interests, right? That's actually what you want. And then on Europe, it's like, we don't actually benefit. I mean, it's been a disaster. I think objectively, the policy over the last 2.5 years in particular has been a total disaster. Germany is in real economic straits. The Ukrainians are losing the war. They haven't built up their military. But, hey, Joe Biden got a medal from Olaf Scholz, who's probably going to be out of a job as well.
I hope so.
In a few months. I hope so. For their sake. I mean, I don't believe in intervening. Apparently, the Europeans, Scholz himself, feel free to intervene in our politics. Scholz endorsed Biden. Do your job. I was at the Republican convention, as you were a couple months ago, and I was getting lectured by a few members of the Bundestag, the German Congress equivalent. Conservatives, putative conservatives. And they were like, why can't you do what Reagan did? And I said, you know what? There's some problems with that, et cetera, like great debt to GDP, our military, et cetera. How about you start out by spending as much on defense as the American people do? Like, why don't that to me is like what President Trump, and against the whole foreign policy establishment. Why? Because the foreign policy establishment likes the dependency model.
Of course. But they like the welfare model in the United States. They want people in public housing.
Right. And that's what I've said to the Europeans. And it's part of my message to the Europeans is like, hey, it's not just your fault. I'm not just castigating you, as responsible you are. It's also our fault, especially our establishment. But if you look at the message from the American people, it's we don't want more of that establishment. And that's, again, why it's so important to have the right policies and vision. Well, we've got the vision. The question now is implementation.
So the problems for the president-elect are the same as they were in the first administration, I would say. How do you staff this thing with people who are aligned with you? Right. And how do you keep the people who presently occupy every position of power, who operate the levers of power, how do you keep them from wrecking the project secretly?
Yeah. And the thing that's different is that the international situation that he's being left with is truly dire. And so there's no room for, kind of like, sort of a delay or
there's no look. I'm sorry. I don't want to start attacking people, but I just know everybody, as I know you do.
Well,
they have no. I mean, the people who want these jobs in the Trump, the second Trump administration, and they act like it's 1985. Like
that's the thing.
They have not updated their files. These are the dumbest people I think I've
has
ever
been great
met.
On this.
Yes,
like in the debate when he said to Pence,
why shouldn't he be Secretary of State?
I think Vivek would be an amazing. I mean, he's there. He was out hustling for the president. he's. I mean, we all say what time it is, but he delivered these memorable lines against Pence in that debate, and then he debated John Bolton, I think at VMI, and it was just it was a very human point. I saw the segment where he's just you grew up, and this being generous, honestly, to John Bolton, frankly, but which so I admired Vivek on that point, but is said you grew up in the era of Apollo 11, and I grew up in the era, and he's younger than I am, the global financial crisis, Iraq, failed wars, increasingly fractious society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's nobody. There's a friend of mine who was interviewed in one of these stories about the new right and so forth, and he said, nobody under the age of 30 I know who's a conservative treats the neoconservative idea with anything but derision and scorn, something like that. And it was just I'm confident where things are heading, but we don't have time, because if China, and I'm not a fanatic on China, right? My view on China is, and I think the Chinese understand this, my view is we need to be strong, but we also need, like in the Cold War, there's a line, and we don't cross it, and we need to be able to decouple the thing, reindustrialize the things Lighthizer and Navarro and sort of are talking about, which is bring back industry, have more autonomy. But at the same time, there's a line, but we're not going to go and regime change them. There are people who served in the first Trump administration who are talking about regime change in China, who are talking about primacy over China, dominating China. That is so dangerous. And often they're the same people who are supporting, total support of Ukraine, which makes zero sense, right? So my view is you got to do the things you're talking about, but you've also got to say, we got to, and Senator Vice President-elect Vance has made these points very well. Reindustrialization is critical, but it's going to take some time. In the meantime, given that the Biden team has used up so much of our weaponry and so forth, we got to husband what we have. And again, to me, that is with the purpose of not getting into wars.
So every year when Apple releases the overpriced new iPhone, the big carriers play the same old game. Sign up now, next 2 years, some big cellular contract, get a free iPhone. Well, what do you give up in return? A lot. Don't fall for it this time. Choose Pure Talk. With Pure Talk, you get great savings on the new iPhone 16, and you still get an affordable data plan that fits your needs on America's most dependable 5G network. Stop falling into the same trap and paying for unlimited data that you're probably not going to use. Pay for what you use. With Pure Talk, for just $25 a month, you get unlimited talk, text, and 5 gigs of data. That's more than enough for most people. If it's not enough for you, you can buy more. But it probably is, so why pay for something you're not going to use? With Pure Talk, you don't have to. It's proudly veteran-led, and its entire customer service team is right here in the United States, the country that you live in, so everyone can understand each other pretty well, and they're responsive. No contract, no cancellation fees, 30-day money-back guarantee. Pure Talk is easy to switch to. The average family saves almost $1,000 a year when they switch. Try it. Go to puretalk.com/Tucker, and you'll save an additional 50% off your very first month. That's puretalk.com/Tucker. Switch your cell service to a company you can be proud to do business with.
How could 4 stars, how could the leadership of the Pentagon support this?
So it's interesting. I think, again, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I deal with, I dealt with a lot of 4 stars when I was there.
When you worked at the Pentagon?
When I worked at the Pentagon, because the thing about my job, I was a sort of, my formal title was a little bit kind of upper middle tier, but basically I was running the strategy. So I had a lot of exposure. I was kind of operating above my the sort of normal level. So I got a lot of experience, and I've stayed in touch with these people. I watch them. Here's the thing, and there's a good Kissinger. I don't think was that great of a statesman, but I think he was a brilliant writer and sort of observer. He said something like, big strategic shifts don't take place just by acts of virtuosity. They reflect underlying trends. And I think you talk to people in the military, and I keep in touch with a lot of them. They know. What I'm saying is common sense for military people. They know our readiness is down. They know our defense industrial base is in trouble. They know the Chinese are moving like gangbusters. They know the Russians aren't a joke. They know we can't afford to get into another big Middle Eastern war. So if you show at the top level clarity and courage, as President Trump has, in charting the direction, and he has people under him who are genuinely trying to put that into place, I think if you build it, they will come. And here's the other thing. Bear in mind that since 2008, the Democrats have been in control almost the whole time. And before that, it was the Iraq War group. So a lot of the people who've made it to the top of a very flat pyramid, they know how to, here's the thing about the military. And you look at people like John Kelly being out there, moralizing and calling President Trump a fascist, which is absurd and inappropriate and terrible on its face. But it's also the military we should respect military service. I certainly do, especially, people in combat and so forth. But, the military, there's careerism, there's promotion, people looking after their own interests, etc. The people at the top of the pyramid often are people who have satisfied the criteria for promotion and selection. Yeah. That's fine. People respond to incentives, but it is the most ruthless selection process. And bear in mind, talk about the Republic, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps predate the Constitution. So these are very deeply embedded institutions. People live their entire adult lives in them if they get to be a 4-star. So you just got, again, going to a New Left thing, you look at it sociologically, you're like, this is going to have some pathologies. Obviously, it's a really important institution, but you got to but I think at the end of the day,
this is going to have some pathologies. Nicely put.
Nicely put. There are people in there who want to do the right thing, or they can be motivated to do the right thing.
Well, that's it.
Fantastic people in the military. And if they're rewarded for it, they will go. They will get it. Because a lot of the guys who would have wanted to do that, they cash out as a colonel or a Navy captain or a 1-star, But if we put the President Trump and his team, I should say, they put the right incentives, I think it'll get better.
I must say, it's just having spent my life in DC and just running into them a lot or living near them, it was always so noticeable. I met so many bright, energetic, wise, I would say, colonels.
Yeah.
But far few, I can think of one Marine, 2-star I knew, Marine general, who I thought was so impressive. I'll even say his name, Vinnie Colonnese. Wonderful man. But, didn't meet a lot of other flag officers that I thought were anything other than politicians.
I think
I'm sure they exist. I mean,
I think real, I'll put it this way, most of the real, there's some brilliant defense guys. I'll mention a Democrat I have a lot of respect for, Bob Work, who served in the Pentagon. He's a great guy. He was a Marine colonel, retired. Andrew Krepenevich, who is another brilliant guy, an Army guy, retired colonel. Often the guys who are really the highest horsepower, real strategic thinkers, they cash out at that level because that's what the selection is for. It's not to say that the other people aren't smart, but the people that, there's
it's so noticeable.
There's a mismatch between how people think he has 4 stars, ergo he's like a strategic genius. No, that's not how the selection process works. You know what I mean? They're promoted for running a corps, an Army corps, or a fleet. That's different than, that's fine, but let's understand what we're dealing with.
But shouldn't the process, isn't the point of promotion to, winnow out the less capable and elevate?
Well, it depends on what you're selecting for.
Yeah, well, I guess that's it.
But I think, hey, how about selecting for winning?
Hey. How about that?
As opposed to kind of playing the game and saying the right things. And, we don't know. That's the other thing about I love the meme of Mark Milley and Eisenhower and their chests. It's so perfect.
Incredible.
It's just, you could speak for 10 hours and
when I watched Milley in that famous hearing talking about white rage, I thought, this is a guy who doesn't have any idea what he's talking about. He's saying words he thinks he's supposed to say. Doesn't seem terribly bright. He seems weak, above all. He seems like the product of a bureaucracy to me, which probably shouldn't surprise me.
And I think and again, to this pathology point, if you read McMaster's memoirs, for instance, he's almost kind of lecturing the American people about their need to double defense spending and stay in Afghanistan until the second coming. And it's it's that touch grass kind of thing where you don't have political accountability, direct. I mean, for instance, they're not elected, but people who are civilian appointees go through political vetting. So they have a kind of indirect political accountability, where the elect, you have to demonstrate loyalty and, you're on the team, et cetera. You have to be aware of that. The military, they really don't have that ostensibly, although I wonder about the left in kind of through the back door importing some of those things. But so you get to this point where you think that you're well, I'm speaking in front of a large group of people because I'm a 4-star general. And it's actually, you really have no standing to talk about that issue at all, because that's a domestic issue that you don't have any political finger feel for, and you're supposed to be much more careful and modest about that anyway.
But they have no moral authority, right, to speak about anything like that because they have no authority apart from that granted them by the president.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we have civilian control, and the president's authority comes from voters.
Right. And by the way, and if somebody has authority, and it's like the Audie Murphy guy, the guys that you talking to who are out there in the field,
exactly.
Fallujah or whatever, they have authority. But I'm always another guy, Frank McKenzie, who's out there a lot, who's constantly hammering, these points. And I was well, he was the CENTCOM commander when the Afghanistan withdrawal happened. And he didn't put his stars on the, if he thought there was a better way, why didn't he put his stars on the table? So like, why are, okay. I mean, I personally supported the Afghanistan withdrawal. I believe President Trump still does, but it said that it's done terribly, and that, which I think is clear. But it's like, you could say Dwight Eisenhower had a kind of moral authority. But the other thing about Dwight Eisenhower, I mean, he was actually a smart guy. But if you look at like his Guildhall speech, I don't know if you remember this, but like he, unlike MacArthur, for instance, he had a real feel for the American people, a civilian army. Like they were offering the award of the City of London. He said, "I can't accept this. I accept this only on behalf of the great human forces." He said, which is like, yeah, it's like regular guys, and to me, I try to have that mindset about like, I don't want people to get torn limb from limb in a war with China that we could avoid, let alone another like or vaporized in a nuclear explosion with Russia. Of course, that means you don't just like do whatever they want, but you've got to like calibrate that balance, always thinking about, as President Trump has said, going back to like what's in the concrete interest of the American people.
You've referred repeatedly to a potential war with China. I assume that would be over Taiwan.
I think, yes, Taiwan would be the focal point, but what I think is very scary about the Chinese, and I don't think the Chinese are behaving frankly, if you apply the way, like you were in Washington from the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Or a little bit after, right? But like...
No, I was there that day.
You were there, okay. Oh, right, exactly. I know you've talked about this. If you apply the same kind of behavior that we exhibited over the 20 years after that, and you apply that model to a China that is not constrained, that's very scary, right? Like, so we just have to apply the same model to them, because again, to me, as like a conservative, and I don't think
I know exactly what you're saying, but maybe that's too subtle. Yeah, we explain precisely what you're saying.
We went from being in the 1980s, you had the Weinberger Doctrine of President Reagan, and Reagan almost getting impeached because he was trying to help just a proxy group with the Contras, because people were so afraid of getting in another Vietnam. And the biggest thing that he would do would have meetings with the Soviet premier on nuclear weapons, because people were like, this could happen, and I really don't want it to happen, right? Fast forward 15 years, and we're invading Iraq, and as you recall, the people who were biggest fans of invading Iraq, the plan was also to go after probably Syria and Iran and so forth, informally or not.
I worked for those people at the time.
So I mean, that was just the starting point.
Oh, I'm aware. Right? Yeah.
So and
that was the new American century.
The way I interpret that is you're going to have people like that because we're human beings, and that's how we socialize or whatever. And if there's no constraint, you would have been like sent to the loony bin in 1982 if you're like, oh, let's invade Iraq. 2003, if you said we shouldn't invade Iraq, you were like, even if you were Brent Scowcroft, you were castigated.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So...
And never rehabilitated, by the way.
Interesting. Well, I don't agree with them on everything, but I had that sort of mindset.
I agree, but I'm just saying,
no, exactly, yeah.
It wasn't like, Brent Scowcroft got rich or more respect. I mean, he said those things, to his own detriment.
Yeah, and I just on the China thing, what I would say is, they care a lot about Taiwan, but I think it's very clear they're building a military to go beyond Taiwan. They're building a basing architecture to go well beyond Taiwan. I think that's, in a sense, almost indisputable. And I think they have interests to go beyond Taiwan. This is what worries me, is I actually fear, ironically, that China is living out the Leninist theory of imperialism, which is they need captive export markets for their overproduction. And of course, they need natural resources and other things to import. And so they have a rational incentive to what the Japanese created, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Every empire, formal or informal, is not everyone, but like a lot of them start out as basically commercial zones.
Of course.
And that's what I worry about. And again, the good news is I think we can negotiate with China about that. That's why I think President Trump's, against a lot of criticism, his willingness to be open to negotiating a deal with President Xi is good. Because we don't have an implacable hostility or rivalry. We don't have to change. I hate communism, but like that's up to them. And the last thing I want is Americans dying trying to impose our form of government on them. Hopefully, like, that's pretty uncontroversial. But I think if we just Taiwan's a tough issue, because the point I've been making, and I've gotten some flack from, again, good quarters from the Wall Street Journal last couple of months, is like, I've been saying we should focus on defending Taiwan and they need to step up. They haven't done it and we haven't prioritized. So I think Taiwan is on the knife's edge right now. Now, I think we want to avoid a war over that if we possibly can. And President Trump has said an attack on Taiwan isn't going to happen under my watch. So I think it is absolutely incumbent upon whoever is working for him to make sure that doesn't happen, combining a strong shield with a rational defensive policy and kind of political message to China that convinces them that, look, you're better off with peace.
Well, the Wall Street Journal attacked you?
Yeah, so they...
How long will the Wall Street Journal kind of be considered the preeminent place where, quote, conservative intellectuals explain their views?
I think they're actually in trouble, honestly. I read them, but they are so far out of whack. I mean, so on the kind of national security foreign policy issues, they are total premises. That they in the same breath, often they'll say our military is in terrible shape, but we need to have aggressive policies in like 4 different theaters. It makes no sense. It's incoherent, right? They're way out of step on the conservative Republican views on like trade, where like Lighthizer and Navarro and the president are. They can't stand people. They've been repeatedly criticized people like you, like Vice President Vance. So I feel like I'm honored to be in this company. So it's sort of like, obviously they reflect a certain part of the, American population, which is sort of, wealthier professionals who are probably more socially liberal, the Acela Corridor, New York, et cetera. But I think a lot of people read them because they matter, right? But at some point you get so far out of whack that you actually become a liability. And they were big backers of Nikki Haley and so forth. So, I think we need, but then with the rise of new media, I mean, you've been a pioneer in this, but others, and Elon and what he's done with X and, and David Sachs and these kind of people, I think there's hope that like, not only is it not going to matter as much, but it may become less and less relevant.
It seems like the Drudge Report to me, you have in your mind that this, Drudge went from, well, Drudge was of course sold to left-wingers. They've never admitted that, but I believe that's true. But the Wall Street Journal in some sense has been also, I don't know. People who imagine the Wall Street Journal is conservative are sort of like haven't been paying attention.
It's like the socially liberal fiscal conservative.
Yeah,
and they were like mocking President Trump in the interview. I thought that was pretty lame and kind of gross.
It's a really dishonest newspaper, and I'm rooting for its demise. I just want to say that. I mean that.
I hope it could get reformed, but
you're right. You're totally right. We've seen enough institutions destroyed. I do think it's really a garbage newspaper, and I wish more people realize that. I can't control myself. Sorry, out of control. So when do you think it'll be clear, like who's administering Trump's foreign policy?
I mean, I honestly don't know. I mean, it's obviously up to him. But what I would say is, I hope he picks people who will implement the vision that he ran on, and that you and others have supported him so ably about. I just as sincerely as an American. I mean, even if I'm not part of it or I'm dog catcher or whatever, I mean that. I think if the primacist types who could get us into multiple wars get in there, you're going to have to get to a more realistic foreign policy eventually.
Well, they'll destroy Trump.
They could destroy his administration.
People like Pompeo, whom I know personally, hate Trump. They hate Trump. And, I don't care what he says, or Lindsey Graham says, oh, he's so great. They suck up to him on Fox News, but they hate him. And they're working to undermine him. And they did throughout his 4 years in office, and the 4 years that followed. They undermined him because they hate him. So I just hope that there is a new generation in the Republican Party of people who maybe aren't even ideological, but just put
common sense. Yeah.
America's interest is the whole point of our government.
I think there is a new generation, people in their 20s and 30s. I'm very hopeful. I mean, I talk to a lot of them. What I'm worried about is I don't think there's any. I mean, you maybe and Trump is like an exception. But, you look at a guy like Vice President Vance, he's only, I think, 40.
Yes.
A lot of the best senators, are much younger.
Yes.
When you look at Eric Schmidt.
Eric Schmidt is amazing.
Jim Banks, exactly. Younger guys. And the problem is people just naturally like, well, we need somebody who's 65 or whatever. And it's sort of like, but I think it's even worse than what you're suggesting because let's say we get in a big Middle Eastern war. And you have people who are talking about an independent Taiwan or regime change in China or regime change in Russia, and we get bogged down. Why wouldn't the Chinese attack? Like, just, I mean, apply how we behaved, the Project for a New American Century style thinking, and just think that those people will be in the ascendancy in Beijing. The way I think about it, Tucker, is like, we're like a heavyweight boxer, and China's another heavyweight boxer. Russia's like a middleweight, and maybe North Korea and Iran are like, welterweights or featherweights or whatever. Those guys can tear you out, and China can call us to a match at any time. And if we're not ready, that is like terrible, And so at that point, we would have to put a more realistic foreign policy. But my view, and this is, I think, a real point to the kind of people who read the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, the point that I would make to them is, if we go down this path of aggressive policies in 3 or 4 different theaters of the world without the backing, we will end up bloodied and bruised. We will have catastrophic defeat. Lots of Americans will be killed. And the American people may very well say, I'm done. This is, all the rules-based international order. This is what it led to. Forget about it. And that, if you want to save it, if you want to save something, like I think mine is like the reform rather than the radical upheaval. Mine is like, hey, no, I believe in the post-war. I just don't believe in the post-1989 absurd hubris going around. The people, the Cold War, and I keep going back to it, but just like, I just try, because Senator McConnell will talk about Eisenhower all the time, and I'm like, dude, Eisenhower thought that if there were U.S. troops in Europe at the end of the 1950s, it was a failure. He's the one who came up with the Uncle Sucker line, not President Trump. So you want to talk about the Cold War legacy? We were pretty ruthless. The Germans attacked us, or excuse me, sound like John Belushi. The Japanese attacked us in 1941, and we let the Soviets do the bulk of the fighting.
Exactly.
And we put Germany first. Why? And I'm glad, as a descendant of people who were in the European theater of operations, I'm glad that the Soviets, but George Shultz, when he went and dealt with his counterpart, he wrote about this very movingly. He went to the cemetery in Leningrad, and he offered a somber salute. And I had the honor to meet Shultz a couple times. And this was not he had strong views and so forth. But I think you can respect that, and understand that we can be hard-nosed and look at your opponents and say, we don't want a war.
We've told you before about Hallow. It is a great app that I am proud to say I use, my whole family uses. It's for daily prayer and Christian meditation, and it's transformative. So with everything happening in the world right now, it is essential to ground yourself. This is not some quack cure. This is the oldest and most reliable cure in history. It's prayer. Ground yourself in prayer and scripture every single day. That is a prerequisite for staying sane and healthy, and maybe for doing better eternally. So if you're busy on the road, headed to kids' sports, there is always time to pray and reflect alone or as a family, but it's hard to be organized about it. Building a foundation of prayer is going to be absolutely critical as we head into November, praying that God's will is done in this country and that peace and healing come to us here in the United States and around the world. Christianity obviously is under attack everywhere. That's not an accident. Why is Christianity, the most peaceful of all religions, under attack globally? Did you see the opening of the Paris Olympics? There's a reason, because the battle is not temporal. It's taking place in the unseen world. It's a spiritual battle, obviously. So try Hallow. Get 3 months completely free at Hallow. That's hallow.com/Tucker. If there's ever a time to get spiritually in tune and ground yourself in prayer, it's now. Hallow will help. Personally and strongly and totally sincerely recommended. Hallow.com/Tucker.
What happened to all the Bush people? You were here for that.
Yeah.
Not just the President Bush and his family, are pretty clear were for Kamala Harris, but all the people who staffed that administration, do all of them still buy those ideas, those 20-year-old ideas, or have any come around to your position?
It's a great question, because I know a lot of them. It's like you. I like a lot of them, and
sure.
Some of them know. I admire some. I don't admire others. And people are going, a lot of them put flags in the ground with the foolish and inappropriate Never Trump letters in 2016, and they're so their hands are a bit tied. So I don't know how they would behave in a vacuum. I think you see sort of various stages of grief. I mean, various people kind of adapting in different ways, or not adapting. Some people are kind of like unreconstructed. Some are kind of like resigned to where things are going. You know what's funny about the Bush? I mean, you remember this better than I do, but I remember like Bush ran on a more humble foreign policy.
I know.
You know, I mean, actually, what Trump's saying is not that radically different from the kind of Bush vibe, which was against the crusading progressivism of Bill Clinton. Now, he ended up totally abandoning that, unfortunately, to his eternal discredit. And in a sense, he was a progressive. He was armed progressivism. Bill Kristol is let's fight the end of history. You know, basically, which is like that's not in any way. And I mean, conservative. I'm not like Angela dancing on the head of a pin. It's not common sense, right? But I think a lot of those people, it's going to be hard to incorporate them. You know, there's sort of and a lot, you know, sociologically, again, they're invested in the old model. And so I think we're going to need, the trouble is that all the credentialing's been on that side. And so
all of it,
almost all of it. I mean, I'm not to make anything myself, but like I'm a rare, and I was teetering on the maybe passing over to the edge of respectability or whatever the mainstream is, you know, for years. And, you know, I think what I find though encouraging, Tucker, is and this is where, I mean.
Wait, can I say, you went to Groton and Harvard, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Well,
so are you the only person in the world who went to Groton and Harvard who voted for Donald Trump?
You know, I don't think so. Actually, my Groton and Harvard roommate was indicating. I think there are a few others. I mean, okay, so you got me. You know, people say this sometimes, and I think they say it about you too. It's like, oh, you're from the elite background. How can you not support the elite? And I'm always like, the elite is supposed to work for the public interest. And by the way, that was the model. Teddy Roosevelt was behind the founding of Groton School, which I went there. I have very fond memories. A lot of people who are associated with that hate Donald Trump and everything. I proudly support him. But I think the whole point is to serve, you know, his service is perfect freedom. The idea is public service, is putting the interests of the public ahead. And so to be honest, I find the current establishment, I look at Morning Joe or something, and I'm like, this is not what America deserves.
Okay, so I have the same perspective, and I would say more broad, the identical perspective, and I would say that nobody reforms the system who doesn't understand the system.
Yeah. And you're always going to have it.
Teddy Roosevelt saved capitalism in the United States by restraining.
And he was hated by his peers.
By restraining the monopolies.
Exactly.
And the only reason he was able to do that was because he was pushing back against his own class. Exactly. He understood them.
Right.
Right. So, no, I'm not attacking you for going to Groton and Harvard. I'm rather saying I think it's essential that you understand J.D. Vance hated Trump. Went to Yale Law School, started going up to the Aspen Institute to speak in the summer, found the people there so repulsive.
He's like, he was totally
that he has become their nightmare.
Exactly.
Because he knows who they are.
Right.
He had dinner with David Brooks many times.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Totally. And I think I think that's, you know, I love this clip of Maggie Goodlander getting called out by this.
I know.
You know, it should be challenged if you're, like anybody should be subject to challenge. And that's what's so great about like X and podcasts.
Did Maggie Goodlander win? I'm embarrassed.
I think so. I'm not sure. And I'm like not picking on her particularly, but like, you know, this is a fair point. But I mean, my view is, and it's apropos because the other woman I think was I think her family's from China. But, you know, even under Mao, I mean, the ultimate egalitarian system, there is an establishment. There is an elite.
Well, of
right?
course.
And of course, Xi Jinping is a product of that elite.
Dogs create hierarchies. You're always going to have a hierarchy.
Right.
So the question is not, do you have a ruling class? You're getting a ruling class.
Is it good?
Do you have a good ruling class?
Exactly.
Or do you have Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken? That's the best we got.
And here's the other thing, you know, and I don't want to cry too much of a river here, but like they are the establishment and they act in like a sociologically conservative way. They're all going to leave office and they're all going to get great jobs on Wall Street and they're all going to go to law firms and whatever. And it's the people who are taking on the establishment and are taking the slings and arrows and hopefully metaphorically alone. But to me, that's the point. That's what you're supposed to do. If you know, as the Bible says, to whom much is given, of whom much is expected.
I strongly agree with that.
And I think you're a model of that, honestly. And I'm not just saying that.
Well, no, I really believe in that, and I'm just so offended by the mediocrity and selfishness and stupidity of our ruling class that I just can't. And I don't care if they kill me. I will never stop feeling that way.
And that's you're incredibly courageous. So,
Bridge Colby, I am rooting for you fervently. I just wanted to make sure everyone knows who you are and what you think. This process is taking place privately, as it has to. But I also think that people who voted for Trump because they want a calmer world, they don't want the United States or him to be destroyed in wars, I think they should know what's going on. So I hope this provides a little sunlight.
Thank you very much, my friend.
Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. We hope you'll subscribe to it. And by the way, you can hit the little bell on there and get notifications every time we produce a video. We hope you'll do that also.